very curious about these tapes. How did you get a hold of them? How were they found? Where were they all these years?
Yeah, it's funny. So like the title, The Lost Tapes, makes it sound like there was like one just like dusty old chest full of like tapes that we stumbled across. And like, as ever with life, the reality is like more painstaking and laborious. And like, there were just like lots of different sources that we would track down over like a period of time. So some of them, sometimes it was like scientists who'd filmed stuff. Sometimes it was like a state documentary crew that was allowed in, but obviously at the time, because of censorship, most of this material was never seen, and everyone kind of assumed it was destroyed. You know, everyone kept saying to us, oh no, that was destroyed by the KGB. But the reality would be, you know, a relative who survived, a relative of the cameramen, would have kept the footage, the tapes, like under their bed at home, or, you know, just stashed away. So it was just a matter of just like figuring out every single person who'd been to Chernobyl after the accident to film, and then just seeing if that footage still existed. And amazingly, quite a lot of it did. And even some of the people who filmed it, who you would think wouldn't have survived, but a lot of them, well, some of them, a handful, are still around. And some of those, like there was one guy who was 24 at the time. In fact, his birthday is the same day as the Chernobyl accident. And he was very junior in the army, and his supervising officer said to him, oh, didn't you go to film school in Kiev? Like, why don't you go to, like, take a camera and go to Chernobyl and like document what's happening? And he was a young guy, and he was like, yeah, sure. Like, what a great adventure. So he went and filmed it, and then it was never shown, like never broadcast, never shown anywhere. And he just kept this footage all this 35, 36 years, and never showed it to anyone. I think partly because it was like so bound up with the trauma of the experience, and, you know, lots of people he met there died soon after. So it was kind of relationships like that where it was kind of, you know, gaining people's trust, and, you know, hoping that they would want to share it with us and kind of buy into what our film was trying to do. So yeah, it was like a year and a half of just like tracking down sources, mainly in Ukraine and Russia, and just, yeah, just like painstakingly, just like a great like detective game of just like tracking people down. And every time we thought we had everything, we'd find another lead, and we'd get like another little bit of footage. But yeah, it was, I think we've got everything now after all this time.
So, for example, this individual that had all these tapes, has he seen the documentary, and did he give you any feedback on his thoughts?
Yeah, so that one cameraman, so he has seen it and loved it, and is very like proud, and said that it kind of captured their experience. And, you know, obviously I was like super nervous for him to see it, because he'd like sat on this footage that was, and even like him physically giving it to us, I could tell was like a big emotional wrench for him. But, you know, we had a good bond. We like met a few times in Kiev, and yeah, he sent me this like incredibly nice message about the film. And I'm hoping that later this summer we're going to have a screening in Kiev, and he can come and see it like in a cinema and all the rest of it. So yeah, so he was happy. And in fact, everyone who was involved, you know, who shared their footage with us, has felt like it's a, you know, it's a special film, and, you know, does justice to what those camera people went through.
You're an Emmy winner. It's no secret that you're known for these documentaries that have, you know, catastrophes really that have touched people's lives. What made you want to cover this story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, lots of my films are quite depressing, I would say.
I enjoy documentaries. That's
It's
why I signed up.
what's that?
That's why I signed up for this, because I
Right,
actually
right, right.
enjoy documentaries.
Yeah, well, that's great. And, you know, and often the most important stories can be a bit depressing, you know, but they're, you know, they're still stories worth telling. And yeah, and I think with Chernobyl, you know, I've lived in Russia, I speak Russian. I've always kind of been fascinated by it. And then it was actually when COVID happened, like spring 2020, I finally got around to reading like a couple of books on the subject people were always recommending to me. And, you know, at the time, it felt kind of resonant with COVID. It was this like invisible enemy we didn't fully understand. People were, you know, even in the footage, you'll see people putting on masks and like getting strapped up in like homemade PPE. And, you know, it just felt like there was some kind of connection between the two things. And, you know, maybe governments not being totally truthful about, you know, the danger people were in and all those things just felt, you know, like an important story at that time. And then in one of the books, there was just a footnote about some footage that you'll have seen in the film, which was in the weekend after the accident happened. There's basically, it's like a beautiful spring day, it's nice and sunny and warm, and like mums are pushing their babies around in strollers, kids are playing, there's like a wedding, everyone seems just like super happy and calm. And then you see these white flashes on the film, and that's because the radiation level was incredibly high, but people are totally oblivious. And then gradually, as the footage continues, you start to see like men in military uniform, people like spraying down the streets. So you realize that the authorities knew that this was dangerous, but no one was being told. And so once I saw that footage, I was like, oh my God, you know, if that was filmed in the hours after the accident, like, I wonder what else there is. And that kind of started the whole journey. And yeah, I guess in a way, I'd always been fascinated by Chernobyl, but always thought it's been told so many times, like, I don't know what more there would be to say. And obviously there was the drama series, which was so brilliant, but finding this new footage and then thinking that we could tell the story from kind of before the accident, when, you know, life was happy and kind of, you know, it was quite an amazing town surrounded by nature and very young and relatively prosperous, and telling that story all the way through the accident, the cover up, the kind of anger, and then through to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like, that was just like a story that I thought was worth telling, just felt kind of epic and important. So no, I mean, I loved making it. It felt like a very pure way of making a film.
And it was interesting that on the documentary, it shows one scientist talking about how it would be impossible to imagine an explosion.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, that clip, it really is unbelievable. You're like, when I first saw it, I was like, this can't be real. Like, it just can't be real. It's too perfect. Like wearing his white jacket in front of the reactor. And yeah, I think he was like 5 years before the accident, so not long after the reactor had started to generate electricity and work. And he literally said, you know, it's completely impossible. You can't even imagine how this reactor would explode. And that was the prevailing thinking. You know, it was completely safe. It was the future. It was, you know, good for nature. It was all these things. And it turned out that there were these problems with the reactor that some people within the Soviet Union even knew about, but just kind of covered up because it was too complicated to try and address them. So yeah, that clip, like, it's unreal. But yeah, really shocking.
So from what you explain in the documentary was that what happened was they lacked the containment buildings, pretty much like the shield around these nuclear
Yeah,
machines.
yeah, exactly. So like, you know, in the States, even if the worst were to happen, and it wouldn't, because, you know, there were also like design flaws in the reactor itself, but even if there was an accident, most of that radiation would be contained within these like shields. But in the Soviet Union, mainly for like cost-cutting reasons, they didn't have the protective shields, and partly because it was part of that same complacency, like, oh no, there could never be an accident, so even having a protective shield is like an admission of like vulnerability. So yeah, so when the accident happened, the radiation just like spewed out and spread whichever way the wind was blowing.
Now it was so sad to hear what Vasia's wife talk about,
Yeah,
you know, the whole story, the dynamic before, you know, like her frustration, like, why am I being sent here? My husband's still alive, and why are they having
yeah,
me sign this disclosure agreement? Pretty, that was sad.
yeah. No, her story is tragic. I mean, Ludmila, you know, she lost her husband in a pretty horrific way, and then went on to lose her baby, and, you know, now is living through the war in Ukraine. So, I mean, it's someone who's just like suffered enough tragedy for like 10 lifetimes. And, you know, I was actually, like, my partner was pregnant throughout making this film. So like the scene in the film when Ludmilla loses her baby, and then you see the other babies who are born with, you know, health problems, and is the bit that I still find hardest to watch, because it's just, you know, just felt very close to home. And these tiny little babies who were really, really sick because of the radiation, and being told by their government that, you know, nothing to do with radiation, it's all in your head, kind of thing. Just, yeah, it was just incredibly upsetting. And but yeah, that's always the bit. Everything else I can kind of deal with watching, but every time I watch it, that bit makes me cry, you know.
I agree. That was the whole documentary. Obviously, is very touching because we already know the consequences. But her story alone, it was, yes, you do get a little teary. I really feel for her.
Yeah.
So, for example, for her, who's one of those people that was disclosed not to talk about it, do you think at any moment she felt frightened to finally speak up about it?
It's a good question. I mean, she, interestingly, I think because the Soviet Union collapsed, I think people feel less afraid. I mean, she still, you know, her husband is still buried in Russia. You know, she lives in Ukraine. Russia has invaded. Like, she hasn't been able to visit his grave for years. So like the situation is still really complicated. And, you know, she's not someone who wants attention. Like, she doesn't want to be in the media spotlight. But I think, you know, we met her, and I think for her, the story being told purely through archive and people's voices who actually lived through it just made sense to her. You know, there'd been so much stuff about Chernobyl in so many different ways that she felt like didn't tell the story. You know, she didn't have control over her story and all those things. So she was kind of keen to tell it, even though it's incredibly hard for her to talk about some of this stuff. But no, she's an amazing woman, and, you know, is having a hard time today, like having had to leave her home in Kiev and that kind of thing. So, you know, I've got a lot of love for Ludmilla.
Mm-hmm. Well, to wrap up, after Chernobyl, what's next for you? What other story are you going to bring us?
So I'm actually doing a series for Apple about Carlos Ghosn, he was like the boss of like the biggest car company in the world. So it was like Nissan, Renault, Mitsubishi, and he was arrested in Japan. He was like a superstar in Japan. There were like manga comics about him and all that kind of thing. And then he escaped, hidden inside a music box. He escaped Japan and ended up in Lebanon, where he's now a fugitive, effectively. So it's a great story with like a Hollywood heist element of him. You know, it was like a former Green Beret who flew into Japan and smuggled him out in a box. So there's like, yeah, it's a good story, and no one dies as well, which is nice.
Well, that's good to know. Well, we'll definitely be looking out for that on Apple. That's great. That's an awesome platform to get on too.
Yeah, no, they've been great. It's exciting. I hope you like that one as well.
I'm sure I will. Like I said, I really enjoy documentaries. I feel there's so much garbage out there. Why not watch something that's gonna feed your brain a little, right?
Totally. Although
All
I do
right.
love Selling Sunset, but there we go.
Well, I have my guilty pleasures too. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. You have a great weekend, and I'm
Yeah,
sure
you
other
too.
people are going to enjoy learning more and seeing this footage.
Thank you so much, Nancy.